Boy, this has been a great 2 days, hasn't it? I really enjoyed it. And I want to highlight just a couple of things that have just stood out to me, just ad-libbing here. I really like the way, this is my first business agility conference. I didn't know a whole lot about it before I came here. And the one thing that's really, well, two things that really impressed me. The first one is just the ability, the invitation to express your vulnerabilities has been really, really super. And the scope of what the group is trying to do is beyond what I could have imagined. So I want to make sure a lot more of my company comes back next year as well. So hopefully you'll see more CarMax people here. My vulnerability is I'm notorious for mixing up the buttons on clickers. This one goes forward. This one goes backwards. Forwards, backwards. Backwards. Okay, I think I got it. All right, obviously the name of this talk is Stop Talking to Customers. And I intentionally made that provocative because I know that's what you hear a lot. You've got to talk to your customers. You've got to talk to your customers. And it doesn't matter whether your customers are actual customers. CarMax is B2C, but we also have B2B. We also have internal platform teams that have other teams within CarMax's customers as well. But this is a story about how we sort of emerged out of a tech product culture, and now how the idea of business agility is starting to take over other parts of the company. But true to a practitioner's track, like everybody else, like Lisa and Jill, is to give you some tools or give you a tool that you might take back with you and under the spirit of try this at home. But before I do that, I love stories, so I just want to tell a quick story here. Once upon a time, there was a guy, a businessman, who used to stand outside of his store and watch people shop. And as they would come out of the store, he would ask them why they bought something or why they didn't buy something, in particular his product. And this is how he learned to manage his business, and this is how actually he grew his business, by doing this. So this guy was Joyce C Hall. Does anybody know who he is? Anybody heard of Hallmark cards? So Joyce C Hall was a young man when he was doing this, and he was actually selling postcards. He wasn't selling greeting. The idea of a greeting card did not exist. What he found out by talking to people who were coming out was that they had ideas they wanted to express but didn't know how to say them. And that sparked the idea, which launched Hallmark cards. The rest is history. What's really, really interesting about this story, and this is kind of a side note, there was a gentleman who worked for Hallmark cards for many, many, many years. And his name was Gordon McKenzie. Anybody heard of Gordon McKenzie? Yeah, oh, good. So have you got the book? Yeah, so Orbiting the Giant Hairball was Gordon McKenzie's book. It was how to survive in a corporate environment creatively. And he was actually the professor, the college professor, for two guys named Tom and David Kelly, who went on to found IDEO. And I just think that whole connection is really fascinating considering how Hallmark cards got started. But I don't work for Hallmark, I work for CarMax. I'm a used car salesman. It was a career decision that wasn't made lightly. And I will tell you that the trust level between the public and used car salesmen there's a ranking of professions that comes out by Nielsen every year of the top 80 mistrusted professions. Used car salesmen used to be last. We now have hopped up to slot number 79, right above Congress. So we have that going for us. But I'll tell you what really brought me to CarMax, and you've heard that from a couple of companies today as well, is that they were at the peak of their success when they decided to change the way they did everything. Now, what they were actually, in my world, they were changing everything. CarMax didn't change everything that they did, but they wanted to start tackling the tech product creation process in a way that was certainly more modern than the way they were doing it. And so, and they wanted to do this across channels too, because CarMax was digital, and that's really the division that I came into. But they wanted that to cross over into service design, into the brick and mortars. But the challenge that they had was that so far the website was just for marketing. You could search for cars. The website did not do anything. The nice thing about this whole initiative is it came from the top down. So by the time I got to CarMax, everybody was all in. And we didn't really have any kind of issues with selling the kind of tech product culture that we wanted to create. This is a drawing that we have up on one of our walls of one of our, what we call a durable product team. And it may look familiar to some of you if you work in the tech space or digital products of any kind. Now, the core team relies on the three in the middle as being the product manager, what I call a product engineer. They have them labeled as a lead dev here, and a product designer. So that triad is the core team that moves that particular vertical of the product forward, and they're orbited by the extended team. We were nailing this. We got this great. I was the interaction designer years and years ago on one of the first product teams that was stood up. We did everything we were supposed to by the book. And by the way, some of our influencers were Marty Kagan, who wrote the book Inspired, Jeff Patton, who wrote User Story Mapping, and Jeff Goffelt, who wrote Lean UX. So embodying all those principles, we set off on an adventure for DualTrack Agile. You can see across the bottom, we've got a little drawing showing how the bottom part is build to earn, which is delivery, and the top was build to learn, which was the discovery portion. We spent a lot of time applying empathy, exploring our problem space, really going all out around ideation, around solutions, and really focusing on an outcome for the customer. So the basic premise of everything we were working on was an outcome for the customer driving an impact to the business. And we're very intentional about how we draw a line and how we use those words. And vocabulary is very, very important. So if you're driving an impact to your business, that is a direct consequence of an outcome for the customer. It sounds simple, but it's a lot harder to do. We nailed it. We ended up being a chapter, case study in Jeff Goffelt's book, second edition, Lean UX. You can read about it there. But we were still this kind of blob of product that had been bolted onto the side of CarMax. I came up with this rather elaborate drawing on the train on the way up here. The square is representing a very rigid command and control, and the think, make, check is representing the product organization that's kind of tacked on to the side. To this day, we're like that, but I think because of the success of product, and as a coach now, I have a lot of other departments that are coming to me and say, hey, we want to work that way too. So we're working on institutionalizing the way that we do this a little bit. But what I noticed in all the teams, oops, I'm going to go back, that's the wrong button. What I noticed in all the teams was as they were going through these think, make, check iterations, some were experiencing what we called learn churn. So velocity is more than speed. It's also the right direction. They were moving fast, but nobody really felt like they were learning, even though they were doing a lot of research. So in digging into this, I went back. I started thinking about Joyce C Hall again. I have a friend here who lives in New York, Mark Hurst, who founded actually the idea called Listening Lab decades ago. And he was one of the first ones to start talking about, instead of usability testing, let's do value testing. And I also studied some of the work of Indy Young, who has really done some great stuff around empathy and wrote a book called Practical Empathy. So here's what I discovered. The lean research teams that we had were digging wide, and they were covering a lot of ground, but they weren't digging deep. So we had to figure out how to dig deep. What I also learned about empathy was there's about 9 different kinds. The 2 that really mattered to us were cognitive and primitive. So what I discovered our teams are doing is they were applying primitive empathy. Have you ever seen somebody cut their finger? And you get, I saw a few people winch here. I mean, that's primitive empathy. And you develop that at the infant stage in your limbic area of your brain, and that governs your fight or flight. Cognitive empathy, on the other hand, develops around adolescence, and it's a regulator for primitive empathy and helps you understand how people are reacting to you and gives you a deeper understanding of behavior and motivation and why people do things and how you're being perceived. That takes longer to build, and you can't do that in interviews that were as short as we were doing in the lean research. So we were looking for a way to stuff our brains with both cognitive empathy and the emotional empathy. So the Listening Lab was born, and that is the methodology that I'll just tell you about very quickly. The way listening labs work, they're all-day sessions, and there are 3 rules. There are no customers, there's no note-taking, and it's not related to any particular product. That was a hard sell. People were going, how are we going to learn something? What do you mean we can't take notes? How are we supposed to share insights? What do you mean you can't talk to customers? And the customer thing was a little bit semantic. However, we do talk to a lot of people when we do quick research that are already our customer. We don't talk to a lot of people who aren't our customer. And I try to get people to start redefining the way they thought about customers as don't call them customers, they're people who don't work here. And try to adjust your vocabulary around that. We're fortunate, people buy cars. There's a lot of people who buy cars. We can find them pretty easily, so we don't have to look that far. Everything's recorded, so you don't have to worry about note-taking. And there's no product focus because we're trying to be broader and contextual in what we're talking about. This is a sample itinerary for a listening lab. Like I say, they take a big chunk of your day. From 11 to 12, we have an optional intro into empathy, then a lunch break, and then we have 2 listening sessions that are separated by what I call story retelling. And so this replaces, in a way, the note-taking, other than it being recorded. So you do a 1-hour listening session with somebody who doesn't work there, and there's interview techniques that you can use. I'll show you real quick in some of these what's involved in that. But you evoke a storytelling mode within the person that you're talking to in the listening session. And then you spend a half an hour talking about what you've heard. And the team, and you do this as a team. And to accommodate this, like I said, it's a different mindset for facilitators. They had to learn to become a student. They weren't the expert. Certainly amping up your curiosity, not preparing with an elaborate script, and only spending about 10% of the time or less actually doing the talking. Kind of I guess a metaphor that we use for this when we're training facilitators is to let them to get them to sort of play the role of somebody who's being given a tour. And the person you're talking to is the tour guide of a foreign city. And so you're letting that person show you around. And you're not interrupting saying, hey, let's go over here, let's do that. They're the one giving the tour. You got to have a lot of open-ended questions and no script. So what we do instead of a script, and here you can see sort of a sample room setup with the facilitator's computer. These are usually remote, by the way. And we use Zoom or whatever you want to use, but we happen to use Zoom. We show our face, they show our face, their face. And then this script is laid out on Post-it notes, so it can change as the interview goes along. You can add words to, you can add, I recommend just like one-word prompts. This is not a script. And you'll see in the intro, hi, my name is, or this is going to be confidential. These are reminder Post-its for where you should be at in the process of your session. And then the blue ones are just sort of dividing it into like an intro, icebreaker, and then what I call a soft close at the end after the main part, where you always say, this is going to be our last question, and then you pause and wait for them to start talking, because a lot of times they'll really talk a lot more after it's finished. Or they think it's finished, and they've been holding back and waiting for the one big thing they've been wanting to tell you. And one of the other tips that we give facilitators is to look for doorways. Like if we say, tell me about the last time you bought a car. And they say, oh, it was painful. We're glad it's over. It took about 2 weeks to recover once it was over. And, all of these sentences have these doors that you can open and walk in. And says like, what do you mean by pain? And who is we? We found out there's a lot of co-buyers. It's not just one person buying a car. What does recovery mean? There's a lot of buyer's remorse in our business. And so what happened out of this is people started telling stories to each other across teams instead of sharing insights. There was more awareness of vocabulary, and they were using the way the customer talks about things, not the way that the corporation talks about things. And what was really surprising, what I hold the most hope for, and this is a future thing, I don't know if this is going to catch on, but what I notice is when the teams are together and they're doing the story retelling, not only have they built deeper empathy, a sense of empathy and connection with that person they've been talking to, by retelling these stories, they also develop a greater sense of empathy among the team members. And you see silos break down. You see hierarchy break down if there are communication issues between managers and people who work for them, that somehow that becomes a bonding experience and levels everybody out. And it gives our facilitators a chance to improve their own skills. And we put a coach in each listening lab, and at the conclusion of the listening lab, they stay over and work with the facilitator and give them feedback on how they think the session went. So what's next for us is that this used to be voluntary to come to these listening labs, and I wasn't quite getting the traction that I wanted by voluntary signups. But once teams started going and the word started spreading, it got more popular. Now we've institutionalized it to the point where we have Scrum Masters who are actually signing their teams up for slots. And these only have to be once a quarter, by the way. So in terms of frequency, you're not doing these once a week. That would be way, way overload for that. But it's also helping us, I think, as a corporation, wrestle with the idea of our vocabulary and how we talk about things, because it's so easy to get overgrown by all the acronyms, all the initializations that we use. I sit in meetings sometimes and they say, has anybody got the ACP for the DPR? Because the VP is asking for this ASP, and it's like they say a whole paragraph without actually saying words. So getting people into the storytelling mode helps readjust people's thinking. And just to give you real quick, this was our homepage before Listening Labs, used car lot. This is our homepage today. Oh, listen to that wreck. That's beautiful. That was a great ending. Thank you so much.